I kept my distance, watching as Eric wormed his way into every aspect of Dad's life in his final months. It started small, helping with errands, making sure Dad took his medications on time, handling minor paperwork. But before long, he was the one speaking with the doctors, making financial decisions, and even answering Dad's phone. At first, I thought he was just being proactive, taking the burden off Dad's shoulders as his strength faded. But then little things started to bother me. One afternoon, I came by to visit and found Eric in Dad's study, rifling through his desk drawers. When he saw me, he quickly shut one and stood up, forcing a grin. "Just helping Dad get his affairs in order," he said smoothly. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. Then there were the bank visits. Dad had always been meticulous about his finances, never making big changes without discussing them first. Yet suddenly, he was withdrawing large sums of money. When I asked him about it, he looked confused. "Eric's taking care of it," he said, waving a frail hand dismissively. That was the moment I knew something wasn't right. Then came the lawyers. I had walked into the house one afternoon to find a man in a dark suit leaving Dad's study. When I asked Dad about it, he seemed unsure. "Eric said it was just some routine paperwork," he murmured. Eric's grin was too wide when he walked in moments later, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Don't worry about it," he said. "I've got everything under control." I felt sick to my stomach. That night, I sat in my car outside Dad's house, staring at the dimly lit windows. Eric had always been greedy, but would he really go so far as to steal from our own father while he lay dying? I had to find out, and I had to stop him before it was too late. I started by placing a small voice recorder in Dad's study, hidden behind the stack of old books he kept on his desk. If Eric was up to something, I needed proof. It didn't take long. 2 days later, I retrieved the device and played back the audio in my car, my hands shaking as I pressed play. At first, it was just small talk, Eric asking Dad how he was feeling, reminding him to take his pills. But then, the conversation took a darker turn. "Dad, you need to sign these," Eric said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "What is it?" Dad asked, sounding weak and uncertain. "Just some financial adjustments, nothing big. It'll make things easier for you. You don't have to worry about anything anymore." There was a pause. I could almost hear Dad hesitating, his tired mind trying to make sense of what was happening. "I don't know, Eric. I should have Patterson look at these first." Eric chuckled softly. "Dad, come on. You trust me, don't you? Patterson will only complicate things. We don't want any unnecessary stress, right?" I heard the rustle of papers. I guess," Dad murmured. "Good," Eric said, his tone almost victorious. "Just sign here. I'll take care of the rest." My grip tightened around the recorder. He was manipulating Dad, taking advantage of his fragile state to get him to sign over control of his finances. My stomach churned with rage. But what Eric didn't know was that I now had undeniable proof of his deceit. Still, I needed more. Over the next few weeks, I recorded every interaction Eric had with Dad. I watched as he tightened his grip over everything, making sure Dad only spoke to people he approved of, intercepting calls, controlling visitors. It was a slow, calculated isolation. And then came the final betrayal. One evening, I got a call from Mr. Patterson. His voice was hesitant, almost guilty. "I just wanted to check in," he said. "Eric came by the office today. He had some updates to your father's estate plan." My breath caught in my throat. "What kind of updates?" Patterson sighed. "It appears your father has decided to leave the majority of his estate to Eric. The business, the house, his investments, everything." A cold numbness spread through me. "Are you sure my father made this decision?" I asked carefully. There was a pause. "I'm not sure of anything anymore," Patterson admitted. "But if you think something is wrong, you need to act fast. Once this paperwork is finalized, it'll be nearly impossible to contest it." I clenched my jaw. Eric thought he had won. But he had no idea what was coming. The day Dad passed away, Eric wasted no time in claiming his so-called victory. While I was grieving, still trying to process the loss of the man who had raised us, Eric was making moves. The very next morning, he showed up at Dad's house with a smug look on his face and a stack of papers in his hand. "We should go over everything now," he said casually, as if we were discussing weekend plans instead of our father's entire life's work. "Dad left me in charge, but I'll make sure you get something." I stared at him, my blood boiling. "Something?"
He smirked.
"Well, yeah. Obviously, the business and the estate are mine now. But I'll be fair. I'll set up a fund for you, or something. I mean, I don't want you struggling." His words were like gasoline on a fire. But I didn't react, not yet. I just nodded and played along, letting him believe I had accepted it. Later that day, the family gathered at Mr. Patterson's office for the official reading of the will. Eric sat back confidently in his chair, fully expecting the world to be handed to him. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat and began. As per the updated documents, he said, the estate, business, and remaining financial assets are to be left solely in the name of Eric Lancaster. Eric smiled, leaning back as if he had just won the lottery. I let him enjoy it. However, Patterson continued, before we proceed with finalizing these documents, I have been presented with evidence that calls their legitimacy into question. Eric's head snapped up.
What?
That was my cue. I calmly reached into my bag and pulled out a small USB drive, placing it on the desk. Mr. Patterson, before my father's passing, I had concerns about Eric's involvement in his financial affairs, I said. So, I started recording conversations. The color drained from Eric's face. I have multiple recordings proving that Eric coerced our father into signing away his estate while he was under medication and not of sound mind. I turned to Patterson. I sent you copies last night. Patterson nodded. Yes, and after reviewing the evidence, I believe we have a case for fraud. Eric bolted up from his seat. This is ridiculous. She's making this up. But the damage was done. Patterson looked directly at Eric. I've already informed the court, and a motion has been filed to freeze all assets pending further investigation. Eric's breath came in short, panicked gasps. No, 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 you can't do this to me. I stood up, meeting his furious gaze with calm determination. You did this to yourself. The room was silent, save for the weight of Eric's crumbling world crashing down around him.
He thought he had won.
But he never saw me coming. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within days, the court had frozen all of Dad's assets, including the business and the estate. Eric was furious, but there was nothing he could do. The recordings I had provided were damning, proving without a doubt that he had manipulated a dying man into signing over everything. It didn't take long for the authorities to get involved. Fraud and undue influence in estate matters were serious offenses, and with my evidence, the case against Eric was airtight. I watched as my brother's world collapsed around him. His bank accounts were scrutinized, his shady dealings exposed, and before he could even try to fight back, the damage was done. His reputation was ruined, and the legal consequences were only just beginning. One morning, I received a call from our family lawyer. You'll be happy to know that the court has ruled in your favor, Mr. Patterson said. Your father's original will is being reinstated. The business, the house, and the inheritance, everything is yours, as your father intended. I let out a shaky breath. I had fought for this, not for the money or the property, but for justice. For Dad. Eric, on the other hand, was in a downward spiral. Without access to Dad's money, he was left with nothing. His desperation grew, and soon, he made one final, foolish move. One night, I heard a loud crash outside my house. When I looked out the window, my heart clenched in anger and disbelief. Eric was standing on my front lawn, drunk and furious, his car parked haphazardly on the curb. You ruined me, he shouted, his face twisted in rage. That money was mine. The business was mine. You stole from me. I stepped outside, my voice calm but firm. No, Eric. You tried to steal from Dad. And now you're facing the consequences. He staggered forward, his fists clenched. I'll take you to court. You already lost in court. I cut in. And if you keep this up, you'll lose even more. The flashing red and blue lights arrived just in time. A neighbor had called the cops, and within minutes, Eric was being handcuffed and placed in the back of a police car. As I stood there watching him, I felt nothing but relief. Eric had always been the golden boy, the one who got away with everything. But this time he had gone too far. And this time, he had lost. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding. I took over Dad's business, ensuring that his legacy would live on. I reconnected with family members who had distanced themselves because of Eric's schemes, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Eric eventually disappeared from my life. He tried to fight his legal battles, but without money or support, he had no chance. Last I heard, he was working a dead-end job in another state, struggling to stay afloat. And I had everything my father had worked for, not just the inheritance, but the values he had instilled in me. Hard work, integrity, justice. And no one, not even my own brother, could take that away from me.